In 1986, orphan kids and their caretakers vanished, and for 22 years, silence was the only answer. An abandoned orphanage stood frozen in time, its windows like eyes that never blinked. No one was ready for the secret it had been keeping all along. In the summer of 1986, the old red brick orphanage sat proudly on the edge of the small town of Mill Creek, just beyond the last bend of Main Street. It was not a large place, but to the children who lived there, it was the center of their world. The walls carried the smell of floor polish and bread, the creak of staircases, the constant rhythm of laughter, arguments, and the occasional cry muffled under a pillow. For most of the children, it was the only home they remembered. The building was run by 3 women, all of whom had dedicated their lives to caring for those without families of their own. There was Margaret, the eldest, a quiet woman with neat hair who carried herself with a certain authority that the children both respected and feared. Ellen, softer in her manner, always smelled faintly of flour and cinnamon because she spent half her life in the kitchen. And then there was Rose, the youngest, who had been hired only 2 years before. Rose had a nervous kindness to her, the sort of woman who bent too easily when a child pleaded for more dessert, or who would sit by their beds long after lights out if a nightmare had shaken them. The 6 children who lived there at the time were a patchwork family. Each carried their own past, but together they made something that felt almost whole. There was Peter, 11, tall for his age and protective of the others, who often tried to act older than he was. Daniel, 9, was mischievous, his mind constantly spinning schemes for games or harmless trouble. Samuel, 7, quieter than the others, often clung to Daniel's shadow. Then there were the 2 red-haired twins, Anna and Grace, both 10, inseparable and stubborn. Finally, the youngest, Tommy, only 6, still had the round face of a boy who wanted desperately to belong somewhere permanent. In photographs from that year, the group almost looked like a family. They stood in front of the orphanage's stone, steps in pressed clothes, the caretakers behind them with tentative smiles. A passerby might have thought it was a happy home, and in many ways it was. But Mill Creek was a town that noticed things, and people whispered that the place had always carried a shadow. The orphanage had been built in the late 1930s, back when the country was struggling to recover from the Depression. Over the decades, it had weathered wars, poverty, and the changing times. Yet stories lingered about stern directors, punishments handed out in the basement, or the night a fire had nearly gutted the East Wing back in 1954. Older residents still lowered their voices when speaking about the place. But for the children inside, it was simply life. That summer of 1986 was unusually warm. The windows were always thrown open, letting in the drone of cicadas and the smell of grass from the field beyond. The children spent long afternoons outside, chasing each other barefoot, playing games with a half-flat soccer ball, or daring one another to run to the woods and back before Margaret caught them. Neighbors often saw them, their laughter drifting across the road, and thought, at least for a moment, that maybe the children were lucky after all, but not everyone saw it that way. A few townspeople carried uneasy suspicions about how the orphanage was run. Some thought Margaret was too strict. Others whispered about funding problems, about how donations never seemed to stretch as far as they should. And there were murmurs of a man, a benefactor who visited occasionally, his car parking just beyond the gates, his figure glimpsed but not known. Children were instructed to call him Mr. Harris. None of the neighbors could say for certain who he was or why he had any say in the running of the place. Still, day to day, life went on. Ellen baked bread that perfumed the hallways. Rose read bedtime stories in a soft voice that sometimes trailed off when she was too tired to continue. The children grew close, forming the kind of bond that only those who have no one else can form. They fought and forgave quickly. They created their own rituals, chalk drawings on the back steps, secret hiding places for notes, little pacts that only they understood. And then came the last week of August. It began with small oddities, the kind that hardly seemed worth noting at first. The postman swore he saw a man loitering near the orphanage gate at dawn, though by the time he looked back, the figure was gone. A neighbor's dog barked for hours into the night, facing the orphanage fence. Rose confided to Ellen that she thought someone had been inside the building late after lights out, footsteps she couldn't place, a door clicking shut when she knew the children were all asleep. Ellen dismissed it gently. "Old houses make noises," she said, "and your imagination does the rest." But Rose wasn't convinced. On August 14th, the children went to bed as usual. The air was heavy with heat, and even with the windows open, it felt stifling. Margaret made her usual rounds, checking each room, scolding Daniel for whispering too loudly to Samuel. Rose lingered longer in the twins' room, stroking Grace's hair until her breathing slowed into sleep. Downstairs, Ellen packed away the last of the dishes. By midnight, the building was quiet. What happened next would leave Mill Creek haunted for decades. The following morning, the mailman found the front gate of the orphanage wide open. That in itself was unusual. Margaret was meticulous about locks. When he knocked on the heavy door, no one answered. By mid-afternoon, a neighbor noticed that no children had been seen outside all day. By evening, the local police were called. Inside, the orphanage was strangely still. Beds were unmade, as if children had risen suddenly. A half-finished loaf of bread sat on the counter. A pitcher of milk had spoiled, left out overnight. The toys scattered in the playroom were abandoned mid-game. And yet, the building was empty. Every room, every corner, 6 children, 3 caretakers, all gone. No broken locks, no shattered windows, no sign of struggle, just silence where 9 lives had been the night before. The town gathered outside the gates as word spread, faces pale, whispering as officers moved from room to room. Some expected screaming, others expected answers. But the building gave none. It was as though the orphanage itself had swallowed them whole. That night, Mill Creek did not sleep. Search parties combed the woods, neighbors scoured barns and fields. Police radios crackled with reports of sightings that never led anywhere. And in the center of town, parents held their children tighter, realizing that if 9 people could vanish without a trace, no one was truly safe. The story would make the local papers the next day, and then the regional ones. Reporters would descend on Mill Creek, cameras flashing against the old bricks. Questions would spread like fire. But in those first few hours, what the townspeople felt most was disbelief, because the children had laughed in the yard just yesterday, because Ellen's bread had still been warm on the windowsill, because Rose had been humming softly in the kitchen while she washed the last cups, and now, nothing. The orphanage, once full of noise, stood hollow, the sound of cicadas filling the silence, and no one, not the police, not the neighbors, not even the families who had once left their children in that building, could understand how an entire home could simply vanish. The mystery had begun. The investigation began the very morning after the disappearance. By sunrise, patrol cars ringed the orphanage, their red and blue lights flashing against the brick walls as if trying to wake the building from its silence. Sheriff Walter Briggs, a man in his late 50s with graying hair and a reputation for level-headedness, was the first to step inside. He had lived in Mill Creek his whole life. He had seen barn fires, factory accidents, drownings in the river. But as he walked through those deserted halls, he felt something he rarely admitted to feeling on the job: fear. The evidence, or rather the lack of it, was staggering. The beds were unmade, but not violently disturbed. Shoes had been left under cots, clothing folded neatly at the foot of beds. In the kitchen, Ellen's bread knife rested on a cutting board, as if she had been interrupted mid-slice. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, unaware that time had stopped for everyone else. Briggs called in every available deputy. By noon, the building was swarming with uniforms. They dusted for fingerprints, photographed every room, measured doors and windows. But the results were unsettling. There were no signs of forced entry, no footprints out back, no tire marks beyond the normal tracks of delivery trucks and the milkman's van. The town of Mill Creek erupted in panic. Parents refused to let their children walk alone, even to the corner store. The grocery clerk taped up the newspaper headline. In her window, 9 vanish from orphanage in one night. By the second day, reporters arrived in droves. Television vans blocked the narrow road, cables snaking across the grass. Cameras filmed the facade of the orphanage, the words orphanage above the doorway now appearing ominous in their framing. Neighbors who had lived across the street for decades suddenly found microphones thrust at them, asked to recall whether they had seen headlights, heard screams, noticed strangers. Most said no. A few, eager for attention, claimed they had, though their stories often contradicted one another. Behind the scenes, investigators built a timeline. According to Margaret's diary, the caretakers had followed their routine the night before. Dinner at 6, reading time at 7, lights out by 9. Rose had written a note to herself on a scrap of paper, check laundry tomorrow, that was still pinned to the kitchen corkboard. The last clear sign of life inside the building was around 10 p.m., when a neighbor recalled hearing the twins laughing through an open window before being hushed by an adult voice. And then, silence. The search effort grew massive. Volunteers combed the woods with lanterns. Police dogs were brought in from 2 counties over. Helicopters hovered overhead, their blades rattling windows as they scanned the fields with spotlights. Creeks and drainage ditches were dragged. Old wells were opened. Nothing. The absence began to feel louder than the search itself. 9 people could not simply vanish, and yet they had. Rumors spread quickly. Some whispered that the children had been stolen, taken by a human trafficking ring, though such crimes were unheard of in their quiet corner of the state. Others suggested a cult, fueled by stories of strange gatherings in the hills. A more superstitious group insisted the orphanage was cursed, that it had always been cursed, and that whatever dark thing had lived in its walls had finally claimed its own. The sheriff tried to quiet the talk, but Mill Creek was a small town, and small towns thrive on whispers. One man, a mechanic named Harold Dwyer, swore he saw a black sedan idling near the orphanage late that night, its headlights off. Another neighbor, an elderly woman who rarely left her porch, claimed she had heard a child crying near the road at dawn, though when she looked, no one was there. These accounts were written down, logged, and quietly doubted. By the end of the first week, the FBI had arrived. Agents in dark suits walked the halls, their presence both reassuring and unnerving. They questioned Briggs, questioned the townsfolk, questioned the children at the local school who had once played with the orphans. They left with folders full of statements but no answers. The emotional toll on the community was deep. Church pews filled as families prayed for children who were not their own. Candles burned at the foot of the orphanage gates. A local seamstress stitched 9 white ribbons and tied them to the iron bars, where they fluttered in the hot wind. For many in Mill Creek, the children had represented a shared responsibility. They had been everyone's children, and now everyone felt the loss. Meanwhile, the caretakers' families were left in torment. Rose's sister, who lived 2 towns away, wept openly on the courthouse steps, pleading for her sister's safe return. Ellen's aging parents sat in stunned silence at the back of every press conference, their hands locked together, waiting for words that never came. Margaret's cousin arrived to go through her belongings, only to find herself unable to pack a single box. The women had disappeared as completely as the children they had watched over, and then came the darker suspicions. Within 2 weeks, whispers shifted. Some in town began to wonder if the caretakers themselves had been involved. Perhaps Margaret had grown overwhelmed and led them away. Perhaps Ellen had snapped. Perhaps Rose, the nervous one, the one who had spoken of footsteps, had played a role she hadn't confessed. Law enforcement found no evidence to suggest it, but the gossip spread like a sickness. For those who needed an explanation, even a cruel one, blaming the women was easier than believing in ghosts. By September, the media circus began to fade. Other stories took precedence on the evening news. The FBI scaled back its involvement, and the town was left with silence once more. The orphanage, boarded up and abandoned, stood like a wound at the edge of Mill Creek. Grass grew tall around its fence, windows darkened with dust. Children walking to school avoided its sidewalk, crossing the street rather than glance at the place where 9 lives had been erased. But the story never left the town. It lingered in the way parents double-checked locks, in the way neighbors turned on porch lights at night. It became a warning whispered to children, "Don't stray too far, or you'll end up like the ones from the orphanage." For 22 years, the building rotted quietly, carrying its secret. Until 2008, when a group of explorers, teenagers with cameras, curious about the haunted orphanage, pushed open its sagging doors, and what they found inside was enough to bring Mill Creek's old nightmare roaring back to life. Time has a way of burying even the sharpest wounds, but in Mill Creek the orphanage never truly disappeared. For years after the vanishings of 1986, the building stood locked and silent, its windows shuttered, its doors nailed shut with official seals that flaked and peeled under the weather. Children who had once played tag on the lawn now crossed the street to avoid walking past. Teenagers whispered dares to each other about touching its front steps. Old men at the diner leaned in over coffee cups, lowering their voices when the subject came up, as if the building itself might be listening. By the early 1990s, the state had considered selling the property. There was talk of converting the orphanage into a community center, or tearing it down altogether to make way for something new. But every time a plan reached the table, it faltered. Potential buyers withdrew mysteriously. Contractors refused. Bids. One demolition crew arrived with heavy equipment, only to quit the next morning, citing bad feelings they couldn't shake. Practical people blamed bureaucracy and budget cuts. But among locals, a deeper explanation took hold. The orphanage didn't want to let go of its secret. Meanwhile, the case files gathered dust. Sheriff Briggs retired in 1992, carrying the weight of his failure quietly into old age. He never spoke much about the case, though those who knew him said he often drove out to the orphanage at night, sitting in his truck with the engine off, staring at its darkened windows. When he died in 1999, his son discovered that Briggs had kept a box in his attic, photographs, news clippings, a single child's shoe sealed in an evidence bag. A piece of the mystery he couldn't surrender. The FBI had long since moved on, their reports filed away in distant archives. To outsiders, Mill Creek's vanished 9 became just another unsolved headline, a curiosity in the annals of strange disappearances. But to the town, the wound remained raw. The children would have been grown by then, adults with jobs, families of their own. And sometimes people found themselves calculating the years, imagining who they might have become. By the 2000s, the orphanage was nothing more than a skeleton. The roof sagged in places. Ivy crawled up the brick walls. Vandals had spray-painted its doors and smashed what remained of the glass. Teenagers flocked there at night, daring one another to step inside, though few ever did. The place had a way of pushing people back. Yet the legend grew. Stories multiplied. Some swore lights could be seen flickering in the windows after midnight. Others claimed to hear children's laughter in the field, even when it stood empty. A few insisted they had seen figures, women in gray dresses, children with blank faces, peering from the upper floor. Most dismissed such tales as the imaginations of thrill-seeking kids. But the orphanage's reputation was set. It was no longer just an abandoned building. It was the haunted heart of Mill Creek. And then came the summer of 2008. A group of 4 teenagers from the next county, curious, restless, and armed with a handheld video camera, decided they would be the first to properly document the inside. Their names would later become footnotes in the town's long nightmare. Kevin, 16, his girlfriend, Laura, and their 2 friends, Marcus and Jamie. They came at dusk, slipping past the rusted gate with nervous laughter. The cameras read. Light blinked as they filmed each other joking, though their voices carried the brittle edge of unease. The front doors were half rotted by then. A hard shove sent them yawning open with a groan that echoed through the empty halls. Inside, the air smelled of mildew and dust, thick with the weight of years. Their flashlight beams cut across peeling wallpaper, overturned furniture, a piano long out of tune with keys missing like broken teeth. At first, they found nothing unusual, just the decay of a forgotten building. But the deeper they went, the quieter they became. The silence pressed in. Their laughter faltered. Somewhere, water dripped steadily, though no pipes should have been running. They entered the old dormitory. Rusted bed frames lined the walls, their mattresses gone, springs exposed. On the far wall, faint outlines of children's drawings could still be seen, etched into plaster. Stick figures holding hands, a house with smoke curling from its chimney, a sun with wide beams. Laura whispered that it felt like the children had been frozen mid-play, waiting for someone to come back. Kevin kept filming, though his hand trembled slightly as he turned the lens. The camera captured dust motes spinning in their flashlight beams, fragments of wallpaper curling like skin, the emptiness that felt too deliberate. Then, in the basement, they found something. The stairs creaked dangerously as they descended, their flashlights trembling across stone walls. At the bottom, the air turned colder. The basement was a maze of storage rooms, most filled with broken furniture and boxes of old records. But one door stood apart, heavier, with a rusted padlock that had already been snapped open. Inside was a narrow room. The walls were bare, brick, damp to the touch. And on the floor, scattered as though left in haste, were objects that did not belong to time's decay. A child's shoe, small and scuffed. A wooden toy horse, its paint chipped but still bright. A hair ribbon, faded but intact. And in the corner, against the wall, something darker. A message scrawled in chalk. The words were faint but still legible, in the flashlight beam. "Don't look for us." Laura screamed when she saw it, her voice muffled by the basement walls. Kevin caught it all on camera, his breathing loud and ragged in the microphone. Marcus muttered that they had to leave. Jamie swore under his breath. The camera's lens swung wildly as they stumbled back toward the stairs. When they burst into the night air, pale and shaking, they swore never to return. But the footage leaked, first to friends, then to local forums, and eventually into the wider world. Mill Creek's old wound was reopened. The town that had tried to forget suddenly found itself staring at the past again, this time with proof that something had been left behind, and the words on that wall raised a question more chilling than any before. Who had written them, and why did they not want to be found? The footage recorded by Kevin's shaky handheld camera spread faster than anyone expected. At first it was passed around as a curiosity, a piece of urban legend, teenagers trespassing in the so-called haunted orphanage. But when local news stations got hold of it, the story became something much bigger. The clip of Laura gasping when the flashlight beam landed on the chalk words, "Don't look for us," played on repeat across the evening broadcasts. For the people of Mill Creek, the video ripped open a scar they had spent 22 years trying to stitch shut. Neighbors who had been there in 1986 watched the footage with trembling hands, recognizing the toys on the basement floor as items they had seen in the orphanage decades earlier. Parents who had once volunteered on the grounds recalled giving Anna a ribbon just like the one shown. For them, this wasn't a ghost story. It was evidence. The authorities couldn't ignore it. Within days, the county sheriff's department, backed by state investigators, descended on the orphanage once again. This time, there was no effort to downplay the discovery. Forensic teams combed the building, treating the basement like an active crime scene. Evidence bags filled with the toy horse, the shoe, the ribbon. Photographers captured every chalk mark on the wall, noting the faded scrawl with the same gravity they would assign to a ransom note. And yet, when the lab results came back weeks later, the findings only deepened the mystery. The objects were indeed from the mid-1980s. The shoe matched the brand commonly sold in department stores in 1985. The ribbon's dye tested consistent with a batch manufactured that same year. But there was nothing else. No blood, no fingerprints, no DNA viable after so long, just relics frozen in time. The chalk message baffled everyone. Investigators brought in handwriting analysts, but the faint, smeared letters were too crude to pin on any one individual. Some insisted the message was genuine, written by one of the caretakers or even one of the children in their final moments. Others argued it was staged, perhaps scrawled years later by vandals looking to fuel the legend. The town split sharply down the middle. For many, the footage reignited grief they had never resolved. Candlelight vigils returned to the orphanage gates. Flowers and teddy bears appeared along the fence, mirroring the makeshift memorials of 1986. For others, suspicion turned bitter. The teenagers who had filmed the footage received both sympathy and harassment. Some accused them of planting the items themselves for attention, though none of the four seemed capable of orchestrating such an elaborate hoax. And through it all, whispers returned to life. Whispers about Margaret, Ellen, and Rose. Whispers about the shadowy Mr. Harris, the supposed benefactor who had visited in the weeks before the vanishings. Whispers about locked records that had never been made public. It was in this climate that Claire Donovan arrived. Claire was 39 years old, a journalist whose career had wavered between small-town newspapers and freelance investigative pieces. She had grown up in a county not far from Mill Creek, and she remembered the headlines from her own childhood, the shock that 9 people could vanish overnight. To her, the story had always felt unfinished, nagging at the back of her mind like a half-read book. When the 2008 footage resurfaced, she knew she had to follow it. Unlike the television crews that came and went with sound bites, Claire stayed. She rented a modest room above the diner and spent her days in libraries, courthouses, and living rooms, chasing fragments of a truth that had eluded everyone else. Her first discovery came from public records. The orphanage had been funded largely by donations, but the paperwork was thin, riddled with gaps. Between 1984 and 1986, a large portion of funding had come from a private trust under the name Harris Family Charitable Fund. No first name, no address, just Harris. And after August 1986, the fund had been quietly dissolved. Claire pressed further. She filed requests for the original police reports, digging through boxes of brittle paper. What she found disturbed her. Certain statements from neighbors had never been followed up. One woman claimed she saw a man leaving the orphanage grounds late that night, tall, wearing a hat, but her statement had been buried in a supplemental file. Another report suggested tire tracks had been found behind the orphanage, but the photographs were missing from the evidence log. When she asked Sheriff Briggs's successor about it, she was met with silence. "That case is older than you and twice as cold," he muttered. But the hesitation in his voice told her more than he intended. Claire also visited the families of the caretakers. Rose's sister remembered her last phone call vividly. Rose had sounded unsettled, even frightened, speaking in half sentences she didn't want to explain. "She told me, something's not right here. I think someone's watching us." The call had ended abruptly. Margaret's cousin recalled that she had recently written letters about financial strain, though none of those letters were ever recovered. Ellen's parents, both in their 80s by now, sat stiffly in their living room, saying only that their daughter was too good for a place like that. Piece by piece, Claire began to see a picture emerge, one of overlooked details, of unanswered questions, of something rotten beneath the surface of the orphanage. But the turning point came when she convinced a retired clerk at the county office to let her see sealed records, files that had been locked away for privacy reasons decades earlier. Inside one of those folders, she found photographs never released to the public, not of the orphanage itself, but of the basement. One image showed the walls bare in 1986, no chalk writing. Another, taken a few months later when police had returned for a secondary search, showed faint smudges on the same wall, not the words seen in 2008, but the beginnings of marks, as though someone had tried to write something and was interrupted. That detail chilled her. If the message wasn't there on the first day but had appeared shortly after, who had gone into the orphanage when it was supposed to be locked and sealed? And why had those photographs never been made public? Claire began to suspect that the vanishings were not the neat mystery the public had been told. Someone had controlled the narrative, suppressing leads, hiding records, keeping the town focused on rumors instead of facts. And whoever it was, they had access not just in 1986, but in the years that followed. By winter of 2008, Claire had collected enough threads to publish an article, one that questioned the official story, named the Harris Fund, and pointed out the inconsistencies in the original investigation. The piece ran in a regional paper, sparking outrage and renewed calls for answers. The orphanage was sealed once again, this time with fresh chains and guards posted to keep out thrill seekers. But the damage was done. The building was back in the public eye, its shadow darker than ever. And Claire, restless and unsatisfied, found herself staring at those photographs of the chalk marks late at night, asking the question that no one else dared. What if the message wasn't a warning left by the vanished? What if it was written by the ones who took them? The winter of 2008 dragged through Mill Creek like a ghost. Snow piled high against the fence of the orphanage, muffling its shape beneath a white shroud, but no one forgot what lay underneath. Claire Donovan's article had unsettled the town more deeply than anyone admitted. At the diner, voices lowered when she walked in. Some thanked her quietly for asking questions that had haunted them for years. Others shot her cold looks, accusing her of ripping open old wounds for the sake of headlines. But Claire was not there for thanks, and she wasn't there for approval. She was there because the story refused to let her go. The chalk writing haunted her. Those faint photographs from the late 1980s, the smudges that hinted at words never completed, gnawed at her. If the message had not been there on day 1. Then someone had returned to that basement after the disappearances. That meant the case was not simply a clean vanishing into thin air. It meant intrusion, cover-up, manipulation. And then, one cold January evening, her phone rang. It was Marcus, one of the teenagers from the 2008 exploration. His voice cracked with nerves. "We didn't tell the full story," he admitted. "There was more on the tape, stuff we cut before putting it online. I didn't want the cops to think we were messing with evidence. But you should see it." 2 nights later, Claire met him in a gas station parking lot. He handed her a battered camcorder tape in a paper bag, his hands trembling as though it burned to hold. "Watch it alone," he said. "And don't tell anyone it came from me." Back, in her rented room, Claire pressed play. The footage showed the familiar shaky images of the orphanage halls, the laughter that grew uneasy as they went deeper. But as the group stumbled out of the basement, panicked by the chalk words, the camera didn't stop. It swung wildly as Kevin and Laura fled, but Marcus, trailing behind, kept filming for just a few seconds longer. The lens caught a shadow at the far end of the basement corridor. A tall figure, too far to make out clearly, standing completely still as the teenagers bolted, just for 2 seconds. Then the tape cut off. Claire replayed those seconds again and again, her pulse hammering. The building had been abandoned. The police had declared it empty. And yet, someone had been down there with the kids. She took the tape to the sheriff's office the next morning. The deputies looked uneasy as she queued it up. The current sheriff, a broad-shouldered man named Langford, rubbed his jaw as the figure appeared on the screen. "Could be a trick of light," he muttered. But the room was tense. Everyone knew it was no trick. That was enough to trigger a renewed sweep of the orphanage. On February 12, 2009, the building was opened again, this time under full law enforcement control. Claire stood outside with reporters as uniformed officers and forensic teams carried equipment inside. Neighbors gathered at the gates, their breath clouding in the cold air, whispering nervously as the hours passed. The sweep began upstairs, moving through the dormitories, the classrooms, the office where Margaret had once kept her tidy ledgers. Dust thickened on every surface, paint peeled in great strips. But nothing there offered answers. It was in the basement where the real work began. Officers shone high-powered lights into the narrow rooms. They tested bricks, scraped samples, cataloged everything left behind. The chalk message was still faintly visible, though degraded. The small artifacts had already been removed in 2008, but the investigators probed deeper. One officer pried loose a warped section of floorboard near the back wall. Beneath it lay a cavity, small but deliberate, as though someone had created a hiding place. Inside, wrapped in brittle oilcloth, was a bundle. When it was carefully lifted free and unwrapped, the crowd outside could hear the commotion ripple through the basement. Deputies hurried up the stairs carrying evidence bags sealed tight. And word spread quickly. Something had been found. Hours later, the sheriff stood grim-faced before the cameras. His statement was brief. "We've recovered material evidence that indicates this site is directly connected to the disappearances of 1986. At this time, the nature of the evidence cannot be fully disclosed, but we can confirm it is human in origin." The town of Mill Creek froze. Claire learned the details later through a contact on the inside. The bundle had contained fragments of bone, small, fragile, unmistakably from a child. Alongside it, a torn scrap of cloth. Not random, not tossed. Aside. Hidden. Deliberately concealed beneath the floor. The discovery shattered any lingering notion that the vanishings were voluntary or that the caretakers had spirited the children away. Something violent, something final had occurred within. Those walls, the community reeled, vigils turned into protests. People demanded accountability. Why hadn't the basement been fully excavated in 1986? Why had floorboards not been pried up then? The old investigation looked careless at best, negligent at worst. Sheriff Langford tried to defend his predecessors, but the pressure mounted. Meanwhile, Claire pushed further. She requested autopsy analysis of the bone fragments, but was denied access. Still, whispers leaked. The bones showed no sign of fire, no weathering from outdoor exposure. They had been indoors all along, tucked beneath the floor for decades. The revelation lit a new fire in the town's imagination. If a child's remains were hidden there, what of the others? Were they buried deeper, sealed away within the orphanage's very structure? And yet, something about the concealment unsettled Claire. The bundle had been small, too small, almost as if it had been meant as a marker, a cruel reminder rather than a burial. Theories multiplied again. Some believed it proved the caretakers had been murdered, silenced alongside the children. Others believed it suggested one caretaker turned on the rest. Still others whispered of outsiders, men like Mr. Harris, whose money and influence might have allowed them to hide atrocities in plain sight. But Claire's instincts told her this was no random violence. Whoever hid that bundle wanted it found one day, wanted the town to reopen the wound. She spent nights alone at her desk, spreading photographs across the surface. The chalk message, the trust fund paperwork, the blurred shadow in the footage, and now, the bones. The threads seemed separate, but she was convinced they were part of the same fabric. One evening, she noticed something she hadn't before. In the background of the old 1986 photographs, the ones taken during the first police sweep, there was a mark on the basement wall. Not chalk this time, but something carved into the brick itself. Barely visible, hidden by shadow. She enlarged the image, sharpening it until the grain blurred. There, etched faintly into the wall, was a symbol, a simple shape, a circle with a line drawn straight through its center. It wasn't part of the chalk writing. It wasn't graffiti. It was older, deeper. And Claire realized with a shiver that the orphanage hadn't just held children. It had held secrets long before 1986. Secrets that someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to keep, buried. The discovery of the child's bones changed everything. What had once been treated as an unsolved mystery now hardened into the reality of a crime scene. For Mill Creek, the past was no longer a story whispered at fences. It was a wound reopening in real time, raw and undeniable. Law enforcement moved quickly, at least on the surface. Deputies combed the orphanage with ground-penetrating radar, drilling cores through the basement floor, scanning for voids that might conceal more remains. Excavators stood ready outside, but each pass of the equipment revealed nothing further. No additional bones, no hidden graves. The single bundle remained the only tangible evidence of death. The frustration was palpable. Reporters demanded answers that authorities could not give. The sheriff, already embattled, began holding his press conferences with clipped tones, sweating under the courthouse lights. And the people of Mill Creek, who had lived with silence for over 20 years, found themselves boiling with suspicion. Rumors flooded back with new intensity. Some swore the caretakers had been caught in a tragic accident, a collapse in the basement perhaps, their bodies still entombed somewhere deeper. Others believed the Harris Fund had been a front, funneling children into darker trades. Still others muttered about old debts, men from outside town who had reasons to silence everyone under that roof. The police chased every lead, desperate to show progress. One week, the focus turned to a drifter who had lived in the woods outside Mill Creek in 1986. His name, scrawled in old arrest records, resurfaced: Calvin Reed. He had been picked up for petty theft a month before the vanishings, then disappeared from town records entirely. When officers tracked down a man by that name in another state, they interrogated him for hours. He was gaunt, twitchy, his answers evasive. The town buzzed with certainty they had finally found the culprit. But then DNA cleared him. He was not connected to the bones. His only crime was wandering in at the wrong time. The following week, attention shifted to Rose, the youngest caretaker. Her sister had mentioned that final phone call, Rose saying she felt watched. Investigators speculated she may have been involved willingly, perhaps aiding someone in exchange for money. A theory bloomed that Rose had driven the children away herself. For a few days, her family endured cruel stares at the grocery store, until Claire unearthed documents showing Rose didn't even own a car. The theory collapsed. Each false lead left the community more restless. Each dead end frayed tempers further. Claire, meanwhile, continued her own digging. She was no longer just a reporter. She was part of the story now, whether she wanted it or not. Strangers stopped her on the street, some pressing her for answers, others accusing her of exploiting the town's grief. She kept her head down and followed the trail that tugged hardest at her instincts: the Harris Fund. The records she'd found showed that the fund had poured thousands of dollars into the orphanage between 1984 and 1986. That alone was odd. Mill Creek was small, the orphanage unremarkable. Why funnel so much money into a crumbling institution no one outside the county had ever heard of? Claire traced the paperwork further. The Harris Fund, it turned out, had not been a foundation in the usual sense. It had been registered under a shell corporation, a single P.O. box in another county, dissolved days after the disappearances. Its only listed contact was a lawyer named Charles D. Harris, but when Claire searched for him, she found no practicing attorney by that name. In the state bar records, no office, no trail, just a name attached to money. Digging through newspaper archives, she found one other mention: a C.D. Harris, listed as a donor for a private boarding school 3 counties over, also in the mid-1980s. That school had since closed under murky circumstances, plagued by accusations of financial mismanagement. It was enough to make her pulse quicken. The Harris Fund was not philanthropy. It was a mechanism, moving money where no one asked questions. As she pieced this together, Mill Creek itself began to fracture. Church meetings turned tense, with old neighbors accusing one another of having known something back in 1986. Parents pulled their children from school for fear of lingering danger. One night, someone threw a rock through the sheriff's office window, scrawling "liars" across the brick in red paint. The orphanage became the center of it all. Crowds gathered at its gate day and night, some praying, some shouting. A few slipped through the fence under cover of darkness, leaving candles or graffiti inside. Deputies struggled to keep order. It felt less like a town seeking justice, and more like a town unraveling. Claire stayed focused. One evening, she returned to the orphanage alone, slipping past the tape while the deputies were distracted. She carried only a flashlight, her notebook, and the gnawing sense that something was still waiting to be found. In the basement, she stood where the chalk words had once been. The circle and line symbol she'd noticed in the old photographs was still faintly carved into the brick. She traced it with her fingers, the stone cold under her skin. It wasn't a child's doodle. It was deliberate. Back in her room, she pored over books and online archives until she found something chilling. The symbol matched markings used by certain benevolent societies in the mid-20th century. groups that often operated as fronts for more sinister purposes. Some linked them to orphanages, charities, and trusts. Always the same pattern, a circle split by a line, the Harris Fund, the symbol, the timing. It was no longer just about Mill Creek. Claire began to suspect that the disappearances of 1986 were part of something larger, something orchestrated. The orphanage had not been chosen by chance. It had been selected, funded, and then silenced. But by whom and why remained the unanswered question. The deeper she dug, the more resistance she met. Files she requested disappeared before she could collect them. Calls went unreturned. A man in a dark sedan lingered near her motel more than once, disappearing when she stepped outside. Claire was not the type to imagine shadows, but her instincts screamed that she was being watched. And then came the most dangerous turn yet. A retired county clerk, the same one who had helped her see the sealed records months earlier, phoned her in a panic. His voice trembled. "I found something you should see. Something about the Harris Fund, but it's not safe to talk here. Meet me tomorrow night. At the church, after dark." The line went dead before she could respond. Claire sat for hours staring at her notes, the hair on her arms prickling. She had wanted answers, but now the answers seemed to be reaching back for her. Outside, the town churned with unrest, and the orphanage loomed in silence, keeping its secret for one more night. The church was silent when Claire arrived the next night. Its wooden frame groaned under winter winds, the steeple lit faintly by a waning moon. She pushed the heavy doors open, the scent of old wood and candle wax wrapping around her. In the back pew sat the retired clerk, his face pale in the shadows. He clutched a folder tight against his chest. When Claire approached, he pressed it into her hands, his eyes darting nervously toward the darkened windows. "They paid me to bury this," he whispered. "Back in '86, I kept copies. I don't know why I did, but I couldn't burn them. Maybe I knew someone would need them one day." Before Claire could ask, he rose quickly and slipped out through the side door, his footsteps fading into the night. She sat in the pew, heart pounding, and opened the folder. Inside were bank ledgers, contracts, and letters, and in them, the truth finally began to take shape. The Harris Fund had not been a charity at all. It had been a cover, a financial front channeling money from a network of private, benevolent societies that specialized in one thing: moving children. On paper, it was adoption. In practice, it was the quiet relocation of vulnerable orphans into the hands of buyers. Some were wealthy families looking for heirs without the scrutiny of official agencies. Others were darker, their intentions far less benign. The Mill Creek Orphanage had been one of their waypoints. The sudden flood of money in the mid-1980s had been no accident. The building had been selected precisely because of its isolation, its small staff, and its pliable administration. Margaret, Ellen, and Rose had been caught in the middle. Claire turned to one letter, dated July 1986. It was signed not by a Harris but by an intermediary, a lawyer whose name had surfaced in other county scandals. The letter instructed that inventory must be prepared for collection by late summer. The language was cold, dehumanizing, but the meaning was clear. The children of Mill Creek had not vanished at random. They had been taken. And the caretakers? The record suggested that at least one of them resisted. Another letter spoke of loose ends, of ensuring silence. The payments that followed, large sums funneled into accounts overseas, told the rest of the story. Claire sat frozen, the papers trembling in her hands. The chalk message on the wall, "Don't look for us," suddenly made sense. It hadn't been written by the children at all. It had been scrawled by those who came after, the traffickers or their allies, a mocking warning to anyone who might dig too deep. The bones under the floor were another piece of the puzzle, likely a punishment. Perhaps one child who had resisted, or perhaps a caretaker who had been silenced when she tried to protect them. The bundle had not been hidden carelessly. It had been left as a marker, a cruel signature. The Harris Fund's dissolution after August 1986 was the final nail. It had been closed deliberately, its work completed, its trail covered. Claire realized the entire town had been played. While they whispered of curses and caretakers while they argued over rumors, the real crime had been shielded by the most ordinary disguise of all: paperwork. She filed her report the next morning. The reaction was explosive. Headlines declared orphanage scandal cover-up. The FBI, under public pressure, reopened the case. Politicians called for accountability. Families wept openly on camera, their grief sharpened by the revelation that their children had been treated as property. But answers brought little comfort. For many, the question of where the children had gone, and whether any had survived, remained unbearable. The records hinted at transfers, but no destinations. Names had been erased, shipments disguised as adoptions abroad. It was unlikely the truth of each child's fate would ever be known. The town boiled with rage. At one vigil, someone shouted that the sheriff's office had been complicit. At another, the name Harris was spray-painted across the courthouse, in blood-red letters. Lawsuits were threatened. Old officials ducked from cameras. For Claire, the weight of the truth pressed heavy. She had uncovered what others had buried, but in doing so she had cracked Mill Creek open all over again. 1 week later, deputies returned to the orphanage for a final sweep. Claire was invited along as a civilian observer, a gesture meant to show transparency. The building was colder than she remembered, as if the air itself had absorbed the horror of its history. They moved through each room methodically, photographing, bagging anything overlooked. In the basement, where the chalk had once warned them away, Claire stood quietly as an officer tapped along the far wall with a mallet. Hollow sounds echoed back. Moments later, bricks were pried loose, dust filling the air. Behind the wall was a narrow cavity. Inside lay 3 wooden crates. Their lids were nailed shut, the wood blackened with age. When the lids were pried open, the truth spilled into the harsh light: clothing, small shoes, dolls, photographs of children smiling awkwardly in front of the orphanage, their faces now smeared by mildew. Records of names and ages written in Margaret's neat handwriting, and beneath those relics, in one crate, more bones, not many, just enough to remind them that at least some had never left this place alive. The deputies stood in silence, their gloves frozen mid-air. Claire felt her knees weaken, bile rising in her throat. It was not all of them, not the full 9, but it was enough to end any lingering hope. The crates confirmed everything the records had suggested. The children had been inventoried, processed, moved, and the ones who resisted stayed. The orphanage was sealed for the last time that night. Plans were drawn to demolish it, to erase its shape from the skyline of Mill Creek. But some whispered that even rubble could not silence what had been done there. Claire's final article ran under the headline, "The Orphanage That Hid a Trade in Children." It was picked up nationally, then internationally, sparking outrage far beyond Mill Creek. But for the people who had lived in the shadow of those bricks, the story was not just scandal, it was personal. On the day of demolition, townsfolk gathered at the gates. White ribbons fluttered in the wind once more, 9 of them for the lost. When the first swing of the wrecking ball hit, many wept openly, not from relief, but from the ache of knowing that some questions would never be answered. Claire stood apart, notebook closed at last. She had uncovered the truth, but the truth had no clean ending. Somewhere out there, perhaps, some of the children had grown up under new names, never knowing where they came from. Others had been lost forever. And Mill Creek would carry both the grief and the guilt for generations. Because in the end, the orphanage had not simply swallowed 9 lives in one night. It had been part of a machine that used silence as its greatest weapon. And silence was the one thing Mill Creek had given it willingly for far too long.